We'll move on to Jessica Peters. She's the Principal Fiscal and Policy Analyst for the Legislative Analyst Office. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Oops. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Jessica Peters with the Analyst Office. About 10 days ago, our office released this brief, which is our review of the high-speed rail business plan. I believe you have a copy of it in your packet. The sergeant is also handing out this handout, which is really just a summary pulling some highlights from what is in that brief. So there's nothing new, but we wanted to pull out some of the key things from our report. On page 1 of the handout, some of this is just background for you. I'll go over pretty quickly because some of the other speakers have touched on it. We just provide an overview of what's in the handout. As you know, the authority is required to put forward a business plan every even-numbered year, and they did so in February, and we'll be adopting a final plan in May. In this presentation, we have some background information on the high-speed rail project. We described from our perspective the 4 major features in the authority's business plan and identify 3 major issues for the legislature to consider. Page 2 of the handout, we have just some background information for you on the overall plan system, including Phase 1 and Phase 2, that you can refer back to. One piece of information that's, I think, helpful on the second checkbox, the authority had previously estimated completion of Phase 1 of the system from San Francisco to Anaheim would cost $68 billion, and that was their estimate in 2012 and the 2014 business plans. And so that's sort of the base that we're referring back to in terms of the changes in the current draft business plan. On page 3 of the handout, we have some additional background information, and again, this is just this is the currently approved plan relative to the changes that they're considering in the draft plan, and so this is helpful background information. I'll run through it really quickly. Since 2012, the authority has planned to have the initial operating segment of the high-speed rail, of Phase 1 of the high-speed rail system, to go south from Merced in the Central Valley into the Los Angeles Basin. And that was the plan since 2012 and also in the 2014 business plan. When that was the plan, the High-Speed Rail Authority estimated that it would cost $31 billion to build that segment, that they would be able to operate it according to the requirements of Proposition 1A, and they estimated that it would be completed by 2022. They began initial construction on this segment in the Central Valley, also pursuant to the federal funding agreements to start construction there on an initial construction segment which extends, or is estimated to extend 130 miles. It was initially estimated to cost $5.9 billion and be complete by 2017. And also, in terms of background information, there's been various funding sources that have been secured for the project, including $3.7 billion in Proposition 1A bond funds that have been appropriated to the authority by the legislature, $3.5 billion in federal funds, and $850 million in cap-and-trade revenues provided through the current year. That's estimated, including 15-16, as well as the ongoing continuous appropriation of 25% of future cap-and-trade auction revenues. So turning to the major features of the business plan, on page 4, we have a map that shows the proposed initial operating segment and how this differs from the previously proposed initial operating segment. So as you can see on the map, the sort of darker shaded skinny line is the proposed iOS North, which would extend from San Jose, downtown San Jose, into an area north of the city of Shafter in the Central Valley. You can also see on the map the previously planned iOS South, which would have extended from Merced slightly further north than the turnoff of the newly proposed segment, down into the San Fernando Valley in the Los Angeles area. The dashed line in the middle of the map represents the initial construction segment. That's the work that's currently ongoing in the Central Valley. So as the authority staff have mentioned already, the plan changes this initial operating segment from south to north It would be a 239-mile segment, and the authority estimates that it would be operational by 2025, and they estimate in that first year of operation it would carry between 2.2 and 4.1 million passengers. On page 5, the next major feature of the plan that we wanted to highlight for you is that the plan updates the capital cost and schedule for the entire Phase 1 of San Francisco to Anaheim. We have a table here that presents the cost estimates in the year of expenditure dollars, which adds up to the $64 billion number that I think a lot of folks have been talking about. This includes $7.3 billion to complete the initial construction segment in the Central Valley, another $13.4 billion to extend that segment into San Jose, as well as $2.9 billion for the extensions to Bakersfield and to have service into San Francisco, and another $40.6 billion for the remainder of Phase 1, which is primarily in Southern California, but also includes the little spur up from, if you look on the previous page, up to Merced, from where it currently turns off in Madera. And this adds up to a total of $64.2 billion based on the authority's estimated timeline of when these expenses would occur. I think it's also helpful to point out in terms of the timing of the expenses, the authority is estimating that the remainder of Phase 1 would begin construction in 2018 in order to be operational by 2029. And so in terms of their estimated schedule, as well as that affects some of the cost estimates in terms of timing of when those expenditures would occur. Page 6 of the plan highlights the final two major features that we wanted to point out for you. The plan does identify full funding for the proposed initial operating segment north, the Silicon Valley to Central Valley line. The draft plan identifies about $28 billion to fund the cost of this, which would include $20.7 billion for capital costs, and about $7 to $8 billion presumably related to financing costs for the cap-and-trade securitization that they envision. This includes $6.8 billion from Proposition 1A, $4.2 billion of which you have not appropriated yet to the authority, and so that would require legislative action. $3.2 billion of the federal funds that have been appropriated to the authority, and the remainder of the funding would come from $17.8 billion in cap-and-trade auction proceeds. And this is assuming $500 million a year to the High-Speed Rail Authority through the year 2050. And so in their business plan, they're looking to sort of pull forward these future revenues by securitizing them. Specifically, out of that $17.8 billion, $5.3 billion would be through 2024 on a sort of a pay-as-you-go basis, and another $12.5 billion would be from cap-and-trade auction revenues from 2025 through 2050, and that would support financing. Specifically, the authority estimates that would generate about $5.2 billion in financing proceeds that they could use, they would get up front in order to use to finance the construction of the initial operating segment, as well as funding to repay the interest costs on whatever sort of a financing approach that they end up using. And then the fourth major feature is that the plan assumes that additional funding will become available to complete Phase 1. The plan specifically assumes that $43.5 billion in construction costs for the remainder of Phase 1, that these funds will become available, as I said, in order to start construction by 2018 and complete it by 2029. The plan identifies some sources that could potentially partially fund these costs, including securitizing operating system revenues once they have an operational segment of the system, as well as seeking additional federal funds, but the plan does not identify a full funding package for the Phase 1 system. So now turning to the three major issues for legislative consideration. On page 7, the first one is the uncertainties regarding the funding plan for Phase 1. It is essential that the High-Speed Rail Authority develops a credible and comprehensive funding plan for Phase 1 of the system. The business plan has some uncertainties related to this funding plan, and I'll break it down into 2 pieces. First, regarding the initial operating segment. The authority is relying on future cap-and-trade auction revenues to fund this initial operating segment in their plan. However, about half of these funds would be from cap-and-trade after revenues that come in after the year 2020. Current law does not appear to authorize the continuation of the cap-and-trade program beyond 2020. And so it would appear that without legislative action, half of the funds necessary to build this initial operating segment would not be available to the authority for this project. The legislature will want to consider whether or not to approve the cap-and-trade program beyond 2020 on the merits of that program, which is to help the state meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals. To the extent that that program is extended, then these funds may be available for high-speed rail as well as the other programs funded from the cap-and-trade auction revenues. We also find that the legislature would need to take steps to facilitate the proposed securitization of cap-and-trade revenues. For example, the legislature may need to specify in statute that high-speed rail's share of cap-and-trade money is the first call, or providing a certain minimum amount of funding from cap-and-trade revenues. And this would really reduce the risk to potential investors by ensuring that this cap-and-trade revenue stream would in fact be available to meet whatever amount is required to repay the type of financing that the authority is considering. And so we think there's several, regarding cap-and-trade, several actions that the legislature would likely need to take in order to facilitate the type of approach and plan that high-speed rail has put forward in this draft business plan. The second concern regarding funding uncertainties is that the High-Speed Rail Authority has no complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1. If the authority goes forward and builds this IOS North from the Central Valley to Silicon Valley, they will exhaust all of the identified funding sources that they have been provided or that they have identified for this project, leaving about a $40 billion gap for the remainder of the system. And the plan does contemplate potentially using operating profits and securitizing those. However, it's not clear that the system will actually generate an operating profit, and if it does, how much would actually be able to be securitized from it. Even if the authority's estimates come to pass and they are able to securitize these operating revenues at the level that they estimate, that would only get them between $3 and $7 billion from this initial operating segment, which would still fall significantly short of the amount that they would need in order to be able to build out the rest of the Phase 1 system. And so just identifying a complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1 will be a critical issue for the legislature to consider. The second issue that I want to highlight on page 8 of the handout is the scope of the initial operating segment. The legislature is going to want to weigh the trade-offs of the proposed iOS scope change. The previously planned iOS South would have connected a more populous region of the state and had higher projected ridership. However, due to its higher cost and certain technical challenges, it's not possible to complete that segment as scheduled. Because of this, to the extent that the legislature wants to ensure the continued development of some high-speed rail system, the proposed iOS North in the draft business plan has some merit. This is because this proposed Silicon Valley to Central Valley line would have about $10 billion lower construction costs than the previously proposed iOS South into the Los Angeles basin. This makes it much more likely that a full funding package for this segment could actually be achieved. We think that to the extent that the legislature is in support of the iOS North. The legislature will want to consider whether what's proposed by the High-Speed Rail Authority in their draft business plan has standalone value, or what changes might be necessary to ensure that whatever is built has standalone value. For example, the southern terminus proposed in the draft business plan does not appear to be an effective approach. This is because it would end in an agricultural area that's unpopulated and does not have the facilities that would be necessary to support train passengers, such as parking lots, rental car facilities, transit connections, and other businesses that would be necessary to support the needs of train passengers. The legislature will want to consider other options and whether or not this makes sense. For example, the legislature could direct the High-Speed Rail Authority to limit work past the last southernmost permanent station on their proposed iOS, which is near Hanford, California. They call it the Kings Tulare Station. The legislature could also make it a priority to identify the $2 billion necessary to extend the line to Bakersfield. But determining what that southern terminus is and finding something that is effective and would meet the needs of train passengers will be something for the legislature to consider as you review this plan. And lastly, on page 9, you're going to want to consider just whether or not the project has adequate legislative oversight. In terms of ensuring whether the project is on schedule and within budget, this can be really challenging with the current information that's provided in the business plans and provided to the legislature in various reports by the High-Speed Rail Authority. The legislature will want to ensure that you are receiving accurate information that's clearly laid out in a way that you can compare from one plan to the next or one report to the next to really understand what is how the project's proceeding, if there's changes in cost, whether those are related to cost increases or savings or related to change in scope. And so more detailed information is needed in order to do that. For example, the initial construction segment in the Central Valley, as I said previously, was estimated to cost $5.9 billion and be completed in 2017. The 2016 business plan assumes that it would cost $7.3 billion to complete this initial construction segment. And the authority was not able to provide to us an estimated date when this would be completed, but it would be after the initial planned date that they had first proposed to the legislature. And so the cost is different, the schedule is different, and it's really unclear, and in addition, the scope has changed. There's been parts of what they had initially planned that have been taken out of the scope, and there's been things that have been added. And so it's very difficult to track and compare what was initially proposed and provided to the legislature and how that compares with what's in their current plans, and trying to understand why the cost is higher and why the schedule is later. Is that because of things that have been added to the scope, or is that because of other things such as a cost increase? And it's really just unclear based on the way the information is provided to the legislature. And so we find that you would need more detailed information in order to facilitate this oversight. And with that, I will end my presentation and happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.